The narrative we've been fed for the better part of a decade was pretty unambiguous.
Oh, completely.
If you listen to policymakers, regulators, high-level politicians in DC, the message about Bitcoin and the wider crypto ecosystem was just this unified chorus of opposition. It was simple. Danger. Rat poison. A tool for criminals. A threat to financial stability.
That's absolutely right. And it wasn't just rhetorical sparring, it was a full-scale institutional war, an aggressive campaign.
Yeah.
It was characterized by a systematic effort to choke off every single piece of infrastructure that supported digital assets inside U.S. borders.
Right.
We saw the constant attacks from high-profile figures, sure, but more critically, the regulatory state was employing tools like Operation Choke Point.
Yeah, let's ground that history for a moment because it really highlights the scale of the pivot we are talking about today.
It really does.
Operation Choke Point. That was a tactic of financial warfare. They didn't pass a law banning crypto directly.
That would have been too clean.
Exactly. Instead, they weaponized regulatory pressure on traditional banks, making it functionally impossible for crypto companies, from exchanges to custody providers, to get basic services.
Checking accounts, wire transfers, anything.
Yeah.
It was a death by 1,000 regulatory paper cuts.
Mm-hmm.
The government used the threat of audits and sanctions to basically force major financial institutions to de-risk away from the entire digital asset space.
And you couple that with the relentless, aggressive stream of lawsuits from agencies like the SEC, the DOJ, against nearly every major exchange.
Everyone.
The goal was clearly to dismantle the industry infrastructure inside the U.S. It was a sledgehammer, aimed squarely at the server rack.
100%. And then,
toward the end of 2024, heading into 2025, the music just stopped.
It just stopped.
The bans didn't materialize. The regulatory hostility didn't just fade. It was replaced by policy drafts, specific, targeted legislation, and crucially, the formal approval of Bitcoin exchange-traded funds, the ETFs.
Which just funneled massive institutional capital into the asset.
Well, and this is the paradox, that you really have to grapple with. A massive, frankly shocking 180-degree turn.
And that turn was not driven by some sudden realization of the philosophical benefits of decentralization or, a newfound love for individual financial freedom.
Yeah.
The most sophisticated analysts, the ones we define as the smart money, they recognize this shift for what it is. A hard, pragmatic pivot driven by geopolitical necessity.
Right.
The government realized they weren't crippling Bitcoin. They were simply exiling the innovation, the capital, and the technological rails of the future to their strategic rivals.
That's it. If the U.S. stayed on the sidelines trying to outlaw or ignore this tech, they were just handing the keys to the future of global finance to China, Russia, or the expanding BRICS alliance.
Mm-hmm.
This pivot is about survival and securing a dominant position. It's not about benevolence. The U.S. empire has decided that if it can't beat the asset, it has to weaponize it.
That's the core realization. And now we are going to unpack what our sources are calling the U.S. counterattack strategy. Our mission here is to really define the U.S. government's strategic defense mechanism for the digital age.
And that strategy is threefold, and it's all designed to ensure continued American financial and technological dominance. We're going to dive into the three pillars. First, the strategic reserve, which means the U.S. is becoming a massive buyer and hoarder of Bitcoin.
Yep.
Second, the Stablecoin Savior, leveraging digital dollars to reinforce global demand for U.S. debt.
Get it cool?
And third, hash war dominance, controlling the security layer of the network itself.
And we're framing this entire deep dive around one central analogy, the digital Fort Knox. The U.S. knows it can no longer dominate physical gold or, physical resource reserves.
Why not?
Because it outsourced its industrial base. It sold off much of its physical stockpile. So the strategic necessity is to dominate digital gold. This pivot marks the birth of the strategic Bitcoin reserve.
Okay, let's transition now to Section 1. From sledgehammer to shield. We need to really detail this great pivot, making it clear to you, the listener, the sheer scale of this transition.
Right. Moving from actively fighting the asset to actively trying to capture and weaponize it.
Exactly.
When you look at the historical progression, the official narrative shift it's almost comical in its speed and intensity.
It is.
Our sources describe a transition from the government metaphorically smashing a computer with a hammer, that was the regulatory approach of 2022, to embracing the technology and literally hugging a server rack today.
That's a great way to put it.
The shift represents a fundamental reclassification. Bitcoin moved from being classified as a dangerous threat to U.S. financial stability to being redefined as a strategic necessity for national defense.
And that reframing is everything. If it's a strategic necessity, then suddenly the cost of regulatory friction becomes, well, intolerable.
Of course.
And to truly understand the scale of this pivot, we have to remember how institutionalized the opposition was. That rat poison rhetoric wasn't just a soundbite from one guy.
No, it was institutionalized fear.
Really?
Exactly. And Operation Choke Point wasn't some hidden rule. It was a concerted administrative effort to starve the industry.
How did it work exactly?
It worked by making traditional banks fear regulatory blowback so severely that they systematically closed the accounts of crypto exchanges, developers, anyone in the space.
Wow.
This cut off the industry's ability to pay bills, to process payroll, or even secure legitimate legal counsel. They were effectively treating the entire sector as if it were engaged in organized crime.
And the lawsuits were just relentless. The SEC's tactic was to launch enforcement actions based on the premise that nearly every digital asset, except maybe Bitcoin, was an unregistered security.
Which created this massive chilling effect across the U.S.
Of course. And it caused innovation and investment to flee overseas, right?
Yeah.
To places like Dubai, Singapore, parts of Europe.
Which offered clear regulatory frameworks. The goal was to dismantle the infrastructure. It was an attack on the foundations.
So the big question we have to answer is, when did this strategy fail? At what point did the U.S. government realize that trying to ban Bitcoin was a counterproductive own goal?
I think it was the recognition that money, particularly sound digital money, operates on an open source protocol.
Meaning?
The key realization was that if the U.S. banned Bitcoin, it wouldn't kill the protocol. The network would just keep running. The miners would simply relocate, and the capital would follow them.
So the U.S. would just lose the tax base, the jobs, and any oversight.
Exactly. The source material is explicit on this point. Attempting to ban Bitcoin merely meant exiling the U.S. from the next major technological and financial transformation. They realized that if they didn't lead, China, or a coalition of nations eager to challenge the dollar, would step in and capture those financial rails first.
So the pivot is really an admission of failure in enforcement.
It is, but it's also a necessary strategic move for long-term defense.
So the new approach is a total inversion of the old. Instead of outright bans and lawsuits, we now see legislation aimed at incorporating these assets into the existing financial structure.
Regulation designed to legitimize it under U.S. law.
And ultimately massive sovereign accumulation designed to secure geopolitical dominance.
They are moving to embrace crypto, specifically Bitcoin and highly regulated stablecoins, because they've pragmatically concluded that these assets are the most effective means of ensuring the long-term survival and continued control of the U.S. financial infrastructure in a multipolar world.
So they're moving from being the hostile regulator outside the system
To becoming the biggest, most controlling whale inside the system. That is the essence of the strategic masterstroke.
That sets the perfect stage for Section 2, the geopolitical chessboard. Because we have to analyze the global countermove that forced this U.S. pivot. I mean, it didn't just happen in a vacuum.
Not at all. The global context is defined by the de-dollarization efforts led by the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Their primary strategy against the U.S. dollar's hegemony is a massive, coordinated bet on physics.
So bet on physics. Okay, what does that mean? It means prioritizing tangible physical assets over the U.S. system of fiat currency and debt.
Absolutely. We've seen consistent, verifiable strategic actions. China and Russia have been the world's most aggressive buyers of physical gold for years, massively accumulating reserves to back their potential future settlement mechanisms.
And it's not just gold.
Not at all. Beyond gold, they're leveraging their vast control over critical industrial commodities. Oil, natural gas, copper, rare earth minerals. They're laying the groundwork for a new global financial settlement system backed by adequate and verifiable physical resources.
Assets that are outside the jurisdiction of U.S. sanctions or banking control.
Precisamente. And this highlights the U.S.'s primary strategic vulnerability. The U.S. cannot win the physics game anymore.
And that is the critical handicap.
Over the decades, the U.S. prioritized financialization and outsourced its industrial capacity. We have sold off huge portions of our physical gold reserves, and critically, we lack the domestic manufacturing and resource stockpiles to effectively counter the BRICS resource strategy on a physical level.
So if the game is won by the country that holds the most atoms?
The U.S. is at a severe disadvantage. Trying to outhoard China in physical gold and commodities is a losing proposition and a multi-year, multi-trillion-dollar effort.
So The U.S. response has to be a classic asymmetric countermove.
It has to be.
Since they can't win the resource war, they pivot to leverage their primary remaining strength, a bet on mathematics and software.
The beauty of this asymmetry is profound. The U.S. strength lies in its existing dominance of the internet infrastructure, global software development, financial engineering complexity, technological innovation.
The realm of code, digital assets, data flow.
Yes. Their counterbet is on Bitcoin, artificial intelligence, and highly regulated, digitally native financial instruments.
Okay, but why is Bitcoin, a stateless, decentralized asset, the optimal counter asset here? Why not just have the U.S. government create its own centralized digital dollar, a CBDC?
Because Bitcoin already solves the core problem, establishing trustless scarcity. It's mathematically verified as scarce. It is digital gold, requiring no reliance on U.S. guarantees. And crucially, it has two advantages over physical gold in a geopolitical conflict:
Which are?
immutability and speed. Bitcoin moves instantly at the speed of the internet, settling massive international reserves without relying on physical transport, logistics, or politically sensitive clearinghouses like SWIFT.
So that speed and immutability are the weapons. The BRICS bet is slow, heavy, and geographically sensitive.
Yeah.
It's atoms. The U.S. bet is fast, light, and globally accessible. It's bits.
This is the strategic leverage they are seizing. By capturing the Bitcoin network through regulation and accumulating a substantial reserve, the U.S. uses its core competency, technological and software dominance, to effectively negate the rival's strength in resource hoarding. If the world shifts to a reserve asset that can't be physically controlled or sanctioned out of existence, the BRICS physical commodity advantage just sort of wanes.
And this crystallizes our core analogy, the digital Fort Knox. What is the immediate practical value of establishing this reserve, not just as a hedge, but as a strategic tool?
Well, first, it provides the U.S. with a critical lifeboat should the U.S. dollar's status as the world's reserve currency come under catastrophic pressure.
A plan B.
A plan B. But more importantly, it ensures control over the foundational rails of the future digital economy. If Bitcoin becomes the dominant global settlement layer for cross-border commerce, and the U.S. controls the largest single share in the underlying security mechanism, they retain the ability to dictate the terms of engagement.
They're securing a claim on the most strategically valuable digital real estate in the world
before anyone else fully recognizes its importance.
So we move from the strategic necessity to the concrete execution. Section 3 covers the specifics of the accumulation strategy, the digital Fort Knox plan. This is no longer some abstract theory. We're talking about current legislative proposals for a national strategic Bitcoin reserve.
Indeed. These legislative efforts aim to formally classify Bitcoin as a national strategic asset, putting it conceptually right alongside the Strategic Petroleum Reserve.
And the initial phase of this plan is brilliantly simple. It relies on assets the government already holds.
It's the initial seed, right?
Yeah.
It's the realization that they already own a substantial stash and simply need to formalize a ODL mandate.
ODL mandate, I love it.
Exactly. The U.S. Department of Justice, the Treasury, other agencies, through years of criminal seizures, most famously from the original Silk Road bust, the Bitfinex hack, and various other forfeitures, they already hold an estimated inventory of around 200,000 Bitcoin.
And historically, what have they done with those assets?
They've treated them like cash. They've auctioned them off to the public market to raise funds. The new policy, driven by this strategic pivot, is a hard and fast HODL mandate. Stop selling. Classify them as strategic reserve assets and keep them locked away.
That act alone immediately removes a predictable supply stream from the market and formalizes Bitcoin's status as a strategically critical government-held asset. But 200,000 BTC is just the starting point.
It's just the beginning.
What's the full scope of this ambitious accumulation plan?
The legislative target is ambitious and specific, accumulating 1 million Bitcoin over the next 5 years.
1 million.
Given that Bitcoin's total supply is mathematically capped at 21 million, this planned reserve alone represents nearly 5% of the total circulating supply that will ever exist.
5% of the entire network removed from the open market and held by the world's most powerful and price-insensitive sovereign entity. That scale is it's difficult to comprehend. What are the two core economic purposes of this massive accumulation beyond just simple geopolitical hedging?
Okay, so the first purpose is pure market mechanics. The supply squeeze. Bitcoin's market liquidity is already thin. When a new, massive state-level buyer removes 1 million BTC over a sustained period, it creates an inevitable and dramatic supply shock against fixed demand.
Which fundamentally restructures the global price equilibrium.
And drives the price up globally. This, in turn, facilitates a critical economic effect, the tacit wealth transfer.
The tacit wealth transfer. Let's elaborate on that for the listener.
Sure. As the price is driven higher by sovereign buying, every U.S. citizen, corporation, or institutional holder of Bitcoin is immediately and massively enriched.
Ah.
The U.S. government, by accumulating the asset and validating it as strategically critical, is implicitly signaling to the world that the asset is severely undervalued. This action indirectly transfers wealth and stability to the vast ecosystem of U.S. technology firms, venture capitalists, and individual citizens who embrace the asset early.
That's a profound observation. So instead of fighting an asset that created wealth outside their immediate control, they're capturing the asset, validating the wealth of their citizens who hold it, and ensuring that future price appreciation accrues largely to the U.S. sphere of influence.
And the second purpose is the core geopolitical goal: strategic denial. The U.S. must, at all costs, prevent rivals, primarily China and Russia, from cornering the market first. By securing 5% of the supply and signaling an intent to buy more, they trigger the game theory imperative, the strategic accumulation race.
Forcing other nations to either follow the U.S.'s lead or face strategic vulnerability.
They're preemptively denying their rivals the ability to build a large enough reserve to meaningfully challenge their control of the digital financial rails.
This sounds less like a financial transaction and more like a geopolitical land grab, which is why the sources are comparing this move to the Louisiana Purchase.
The analogy holds tremendous weight. It highlights the long-term strategic depth of this pivot.
How so?
When President Jefferson executed the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, he got a massive, largely unknown territory, the middle of the continent, before the true economic and resource value of that land was realized by global competitors like France or Britain.
He was securing a claim on future strategic power at a discount?
Exactly. The strategic Bitcoin reserve is viewed identically. Buying a foundational strategic asset, the global digital settlement layer, before the rest of the world truly understands its value, and before the cost becomes prohibitive for the U.S. Treasury itself. They are buying the economic future.
We've covered accumulation. Now we move to the third pillar of this counterattack strategy, the hash war and network control. This is where the U.S. strategy shifts from just holding the asset to controlling the underlying mechanism that secures it. This is arguably the most aggressive and necessary pillar for long-term dominance.
Yeah, if accumulation is the buying, then mining dominance is the securing and the weaponizing. It centers around establishing comprehensive control over the global hash rate, the computational power dedicated to validating and securing Bitcoin transactions.
And we absolutely must highlight China's monumental strategic error here.
Oh, absolutely.
Because without it, the U.S. could never have executed this pivot so successfully.
China's decision in 2021 to ban Bitcoin mining outright, motivated by perceived environmental concerns, capital controls, and a fundamental preference for centralized digital currency, that was perhaps the single greatest geopolitical gift to the U.S. in the last decade.
A gift.
It displaced the majority of the global hash rate almost overnight. Instead of crushing Bitcoin, China effectively handed the U.S. a strategic advantage on a silver platter.
And the U.S., primarily through politically savvy states like Texas, strategically welcomed those displaced miners.
With open arms, cheap energy contracts, and minimal regulatory friction.
And now, Texas, alongside other U.S. regions, is indisputably the global mining capital of the world.
It is.
So what are the two primary immediate benefits the U.S. gains from attracting and stabilizing this massive mining infrastructure?
Okay, the first benefit, which is often counterintuitive to the public, relates to energy grid stabilization.
Right, because people just hear they use a lot of power.
Exactly. But yes, miners consume vast amounts of power, but their operational profile is unique. They function as a flexible load, which means they are highly adaptive buyers of energy. They can be paid by utility operators, often heavily subsidized, to instantly reduce their power consumption when the public grid faces peak demand stress.
Like a severe heat wave in a Texas summer or an unexpected cold snap.
Precisely. They absorb excess, cheap power when renewables like wind or solar overproduce, and they instantly turn off when that power is desperately needed by hospitals or residential users.
So they aren't just consumers, they're providing critical grid services. They're like an insurance policy for the utility company.
That's a great way to put it. This integration has been so successful that the U.S. energy sector now views large-scale Bitcoin mining as critical infrastructure, not merely a consumer.
That brings us to the second and far more potent benefit, pure national security and the hash war implications.
Right.
The country that commands the most hash rate effectively secures and potentially controls the network. What happens when the U.S. controls over 50% of that global hash rate?
Controlling that much hash rate grants the U.S. strategic leverage at the protocol layer. This is where the weaponization occurs through OFAC compliance.
OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control.
The same office tasked with enforcing sanctions against entities hostile to U.S. interests. If the vast majority of transaction validators, the miners and the pools they join, are U.S.-based and regulated, they can be compelled by law to filter the blocks they produce.
Filter the blocks. Okay, explain the technical mechanism of how a miner censors a transaction.
So when a U.S.-regulated mining pool constructs a new block to add to the blockchain, they can be forced to exclude transactions originating from wallets or entities that are on the OFAC sanction list.
So they just get a blacklist of addresses?
They get a list of blacklisted addresses, and their software simply refuses to include those specific transactions in their block templates. Now, if the U.S. controls, say, 60% of the hash rate, 60% of the time, the block being confirmed will not include a sanctioned transaction.
And what happens to that transaction?
Well, it will eventually be confirmed by a foreign or unregulated miner, but the process is severely delayed, unreliable, and more expensive.
So the U.S. uses the physical location of the mining infrastructure to dictate terms at the fundamental protocol level, essentially turning Bitcoin into censorable money for hostile actors.
It transforms Bitcoin from a neutral, stateless global money into a Western money, a financial rail system aligned with U.S. geopolitical and sanction enforcement interests. They are attempting to capture the very censorship resistance Bitcoin was designed to offer.
And the smart money is already moving into this space.
Oh, absolutely. The source analysis shows significant institutional investment pouring into U.S.-based miners like Marathon Mara and Riot Platforms Riot. These investors are betting that due to the grid stabilization and national security roles, these mining operations will soon be officially designated as critical infrastructure by the Department of Homeland Security.
And that designation comes with regulatory protections, potential subsidies.
And a clear signal of long-term government support, cementing U.S. dominance over the mining layer and the security of the network.
We've covered the digital gold accumulation and the hash rate security. Now we shift to the critical stabilizing mechanism in Section 5, the Stablecoin Savior. This is the really sophisticated half of the strategy, focused not on replacing the U.S. dollar, but on reinforcing and extending its life.
Yes, the U.S. realized that trying to kill stablecoins was fundamentally self-defeating. Well, while Bitcoin challenges the mechanism of money settlement, stablecoins reinforce the unit of money, the dollar. They are stealth dollarization, using the efficiency of blockchain rails to export U.S. currency demand globally and, most critically, to save the U.S. debt market.
Okay, let's focus on the mechanism of debt demand. This is where stablecoins provide measurable, material support to the U.S. Treasury.
It's a beautifully simple, closed economic loop that generates perpetual non-sovereign demand for U.S. government debt.
Walk us through it.
To issue a dollar-pegged stablecoin, whether it's the largest issuer, Tether, USDT, or a U.S.-regulated entity like Circle, USDC, the issuer must hold sufficient reserves to guarantee the one-to-one peg.
Right.
Where do they hold those reserves? They must hold them in the safest, most liquid, and most regulated assets in the world, which are overwhelmingly short-term U.S. Treasury bills and cash equivalents held in U.S. banks.
So every dollar of stablecoin issued anywhere in the world is almost immediately recycled into creating a new buyer for U.S. government debt. It's an automated flywheel.
Precisely. And the scale of this recycling mechanism is no longer negligible. It's sovereign level.
Sovereign level.
The specific startling facts from our sources are that Tether, the largest stablecoin issuer, is now ranked among the top 15 buyers of U.S. government debt globally.
Top 15. So we're not talking about a boutique hedge fund. This is sovereign-level purchasing power.
We're talking about a private, non-sovereign entity purchasing T-bills at a volume that rivals major foreign central banks.
That's incredible.
And astonishingly, Tether buys more U.S. debt than several G7 economies combined. It's specifically noted in our sources as buying more U.S. government debt than an entire country like Germany.
More than Germany. Wow.
The cumulative market cap of stablecoins is well over $150 billion and growing rapidly. This massive capital has stepped in at a moment when traditional foreign buyers like China are actively reducing their holdings, providing a critical life raft for the U.S. debt market by injecting continuous automated demand.
That makes stablecoins an indispensable systemic support structure for the current U.S. financial system. They are prolonging the life of the dollar's dominance.
They absolutely are. They created a perpetual growing buyer for U.S. debt. a buyer motivated by the global need for digital liquidity rather than sovereign political alignment.
Okay, let's discuss the global dynamics. Exporting the dollar via stealth dollarization. Where is all this explosive stablecoin demand coming from?
It's coming from the high inflation, capital-controlled economies of the global south, places like Argentina, Nigeria, Turkey, and various nations across Southeast Asia.
Right.
When the local currency is hyperinflating, people desperately seek refuge. And crucially, they are not flocking to the Chinese yuan, which is centrally controlled, difficult to access, and politically questionable.
No, they're using crypto rails to instantly achieve dollar parity.
They flock to USDT or USDC. These crypto rails offer ease and accessibility, bypassing failing local banking systems and monetary policies. They're choosing to dollarize their savings and commerce via digital tokens.
So the US government realized that if they banned stablecoins, they would not only kill this crucial demand mechanism for their own debt,
But they would also cut off the most effective export mechanism for the US dollar today.
which necessitates the current strategy: regulate them, make them auditably safe, and fully integrate them inside the tent of the US financial system.
Which is why the source calls stablecoins the new petrodollar.
The connection is precise.
The original petrodollar system, post-1970s, forced global economies to demand US dollars to purchase essential oil. That demand for dollars then forced those nations to hold US debt as reserves.
And stablecoins operate identically in the digital realm.
Exactly. Accessing the essential global digital economic rails, which are anchored by highly liquid dollar-pegged stablecoins, forces global entities to demand and hold U.S. Treasury debt to maintain liquidity and market access. It's an updated, digitized mechanism for sustaining U.S. financial hegemony, built on code, not crude oil.
We've established the three primary mechanisms: accumulation, hash dominance, and stablecoin reinforcement. Now we arrive at Section 6, the game theory trigger.
Okay.
This is the critical moment where this geopolitical pivot becomes instantly relevant to every sovereign wealth fund, every central bank, and critically to you, the individual investor.
We're analyzing the immediate market consequence of the largest whale in the world, the U.S. Treasury, entering the market as a massive, systematic, and most importantly, price-insensitive buyer.
And we already saw a glimpse of the price effect with private institutional buyers. The BlackRock ETF launch brought in a ton of institutional capital, and Bitcoin surged rapidly past its previous all-time highs to $73,000.
Right, and that was massive private demand. Now, scale that effect up. Imagine the U.S. government, an entity operating with a national security mandate, not a profit motive, systematically buying 1 million BTC over the next 5 years.
They are entirely price insensitive.
Completely. They will die at $80,000, $150,000, or even $500,000 if the legislative goal is to secure 5% of the total supply for strategic denial against rivals. The price level is secondary to the strategic imperative.
So the game theory is dictated by this necessity. Once the U.S. government formalizes this plan, establishing the digital Fort Knox, it creates an impossible strategic dilemma for other major sovereign nations.
Saudi Arabia, Japan, the UK, Singapore, Switzerland.
Right.
The question for them is no longer, should we buy Bitcoin? The question is, can we afford to be left with zero Bitcoin, knowing that the United States, our primary competitor and strategic benchmark, is hoarding it as a critical strategic asset?
And the answer geopolitically is no.
It has to be no. Being left with zero Bitcoin becomes an unacceptable strategic risk. It's a form of relative financial disarmament.
This triggers what we should call the strategic accumulation race.
Exactly. They are forced into a position of strategic imperative, not retail FOMO. They must begin buying to protect their own national interest and to maintain parity with the U.S. And crucially, they must front-run the U.S. government accumulation mandate.
Explain that front-running dynamic at the sovereign level.
Okay, if the U.S. publicly announces it intends to buy 1 million BTC over 5 years, every other nation knows that the supply will rapidly dry up and the price will be forced dramatically higher.
Okay.
Therefore, any nation concerned with long-term strategic resilience, which is every nation, must begin discreetly accumulating Bitcoin now before the official U.S. buying mandate is executed in full. If they wait until the U.S. has cornered the supply, the cost to acquire even a small reserve will be orders of magnitude higher.
So the U.S. action triggers a global existential race. What are the rules of this new game?
The rules are simple and carry massive implications for global power dynamics. The first nations to successfully establish a meaningful Bitcoin reserve win strategic advantage and financial resilience in the new digital economy. They get to leverage the U.S. price bid to validate their own portfolios.
And the last nations to buy.
The last nations to recognize this shift and begin buying will find their treasuries massively devalued relative to the new global standard. They will effectively go broke in strategic terms, having missed the opportunity to hedge against the shift from physics to math.
Which brings this analysis home to the listener. The Smart Money Playbook is aligning your portfolio with this coming inevitable sovereign bid.
The buying pressure is no longer just institutions. It is coming from the highest echelons of government for purely existential national security reasons. You, the listener, have the opportunity to buy before the largest, most aggressive buyer the world has ever seen completes their mandate. The price is going to be secondary to the mission, and aligning your personal portfolio with that mission is the clearest play the current geopolitical landscape offers.
We have established the bullish case for price and adoption driven by geopolitics. We must now transition to Section 7, the risk and the ethos debate.
Right.
This is the philosophical core. Is this geopolitical success ultimately good for Bitcoin, or is it fundamentally detrimental to the decentralized ethos it was built on?
This is the central conflict. For the price, the news is unambiguously positive. Sovereign adoption drives scarcity, legitimacy, capital flow. But Bitcoin was designed to be money without a master, permissionless, and resistant to state interference.
So if the U.S. government is now the largest single holder, controls the majority of the mining hash rate through regulated compliant miners, and structurally dictates terms for all the on-ramps and off-ramps via regulated stablecoins.
Then haven't they effectively captured or co-opted the asset?
Exactly. Doesn't the centralization of infrastructure fundamentally compromise its decentralization?
Well, the centralization of control not over the code, which remains immutable, but over the infrastructure layer and the strategic reserves, it creates immense leverage for the state.
And the tension is clear.
Governments love the asset's inherent value, its scarcity, and the fact that number go up because it makes their strategic reserve more potent. But they fundamentally despise the privacy and censorship resistance it offers the individual.
So this captured infrastructure leads directly to the specific structural risk of a two-tier system. Let's detail what that looks like in practical terms for the average holder.
Okay, we project a division into two distinct categories of the asset, mediated by regulation and compliance. Tier 1, whitelisted Bitcoin.
Okay.
This is Bitcoin that is fully KYC. No, you're customer compliant, held in audited accounts by regulated U.S. entities like BlackRock, Fidelity, and of course the U.S. government itself. This Bitcoin is high value, easily transacted through regulated rails, and is the version used for institutional settlement and official commerce.
It's clean money, but inherently censorable.
Yes, and the counterpoint.
The Bitcoin held by those who still believe in the original ethos.
Tier 2, dark Bitcoin. This is Bitcoin held on private wallets, self-custodied, often moved through privacy-enhancing protocols or mixers, and used by individuals, privacy advocates, or entities actively hostile to U.S. Western interests. This Bitcoin becomes subject to intense regulatory targeting.
What does that mean, targeting?
It may eventually be labeled as tainted, potentially discounted when entering the regulated system, or outright illegal to use within the whitelisted financial rails.
This isn't just theory. I mean, we've seen the government target privacy protocols like coin mixers with unprecedented intensity, often labeling them money laundering tools.
This is the war on cash morphing into the war on private crypto.
That is the inevitable strategic extrapolation.
The state's goal is total financial visibility and control. They will tolerate the price growth and geopolitical utility of the Tier 1 system, but they cannot tolerate the inherent freedom offered by self-custody and privacy tools.
So we have to expect a concerted regulatory effort to tighten the regulations around the network's edges.
Mandating strict KYC for wallet providers, scrutinizing mixers, and making self-custody increasingly difficult, even as the overall price of the asset skyrockets. The growth in value may come directly at the expense of Bitcoin's core promise of permissionless privacy.
So the U.S. pivot is a classic double-edged sword for the Bitcoin community. Massive, world-changing validation and price uplift.
Coupled with the erosion of the very censorship-resistant principles Bitcoin was designed to champion. The question then becomes, which force wins out in the long run? The price appreciation or the ethos?
And every holder must make a conscious decision about where they want their coins to live.
In the regulated, highly valued, yet potentially censorable Tier 1 system, or the risky but truly permissionless Tier 2 system. The government's actions have ensured that this decision is no longer theoretical, it's becoming structural.
That brings us to the close of this intensive deep dive. The final summary of our investigation is, I think, very clear. The U.S. government has executed a breathtaking and necessary 180-degree strategic pivot.
No question.
They realized they were losing the geopolitical game by fighting crypto and are now actively accumulating and weaponizing it against their rivals through the digital Fort Knox plan, dominance over the hash rate, and stealth dollarization via stablecoins.
The empire is striking back, but this time the weapon of choice is code, and they are buying it aggressively.
So based on this analysis, we can distill the essential smart money playbook for you, our listener.
Let's do it.
Number one, don't fight the sovereign bid. The single most powerful entity in the world has determined that Bitcoin is a strategic necessity. If the U.S. government is mandated to buy 5% of the global supply, the price is going up. Align your portfolio with the sovereign accumulation trend.
Number two, own the asset directly. While U.S.-based miners, exchanges, and ETFs are valuable proxies, the strategic reserve isn't buying stock, they are buying BTC. Owning the underlying asset itself is the safest, most direct play to capitalize on the inevitable sovereign bid, eliminating counterparty risk.
Number three, monitor stablecoins. The massive, continuous growth of USDC and Tether is a direct, measurable proxy for the extended geopolitical power of the U.S. dollar empire. Don't view them as competitive crypto tech. View them as the automated digital infrastructure that sustains the debt market and buys the U.S. empire precious time.
And finally, given the structural centralization risk we just detailed, keep a cold stash.
So important.
Hedge the risk of the whitelisted system by securing a portion of your coins in self-custody using a hardware wallet. If regulators succeed in creating that two-tier system, controlling your own keys is the only mechanism to ensure your coins retain their permissionless, censorship-resistant properties. Control your keys.
This has been a monumental geopolitical shift compressed into just a few quarters of intense policy change. It's an admission that the old financial architecture is vulnerable and that math is the new physics.
What is truly fascinating here is the scale of the paradox. A technology created to resist centralization and state control is now being repurposed by the world's leading superpower to maintain and extend its centralized financial dominance. It is the ultimate co-option.
So what does this all mean? We'll leave you with this final critical thought to mull over, building on everything we've covered today. If the U.S. government successfully creates the digital Fort Knox, accumulating 1 million Bitcoin and controlling the network's security, does that unprecedented centralization ultimately defeat the core, freedom-focused purpose of decentralized money? Or does that centralization simply cement Bitcoin's status as the world's ultimate reserve asset, having been endorsed, captured, and validated by the very superpower it was designed to transcend?
The answer will define whether Bitcoin remains a revolutionary tool or simply becomes the next generation of global strategic power. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.